Okay, we're going to make a start. So hello, everybody. I just need to check. Yeah, we've got everybody here. And yeah, that's great. So like just to welcome everybody tonight, we've got our latest panel discussion, which is on culture after lockdown. We've got a great panel tonight, which I'll just introduce, and then we're going to have for the panel members just going to make some opening remarks. And then we're going to go, and I've got three questions, then we're going to go to audience questions. So if you've got a question as it comes through, just use the chat and I'll call you in as and when, and then I'll try and direct because we've got 7 people on the panel. I'll try and direct the questions a little bit as well. But if you're on the panel as well and you want to answer a question, I'm not calling you in, do indicate and I'll call you in as well. So first of all, I'd like to welcome my colleague Tracy Braben, who's our fellow culture minister. And herself, an actor before she came to Parliament. Everybody remember Tracy from Coronation Street, and she's worked up and down the country. Tom Gray, who's in the band Gomez. He's also a member of the board of the PRS and involved with the Ivor Academy. And I see Tom at a lot of my APBG for music events. He's greatly involved in the industry. Lisa Holdsworth, who's a screenwriter, and her credits include Ackley Bridge, Midsummer Murders, New Tricks. And she's also deputy chair at the Writers Guild of Great Britain, so she can give us a great perspective from writers right around the country. Simon's the bassist in the Kaiser Chiefs, but he's also the president of the Leeds United Supporters Trust. We'll try and stay away from the difficult topic of whether Leeds should be promoted or not. Obviously, me and Sam think they should, and there'll be others on the call that might not, and try and stick to other music and sport-related issues with Simon. We've got Ian Livingston. Ian, I've met Ian through the video games group, but that wasn't the first time I encountered Ian. The first time I encountered Ian was as a 9-year-old boy in the local library reading The Warlock of Far Top Mountain. He's an author. He's he founder of the Games Workshop. He's been president of Eidos Interactive, which made the Lara Croft games, and previously with Domark, and he's also founder of the National Video Games Museum. So he'll have a lot of perspectives on the different cultural aspects that we're talking about tonight. We've got Maureen Beattie, who's the president of Equity, and most recently was in Deadwater Fell, where she played a farmer, and she was a recurring character in Taggart. And I know we're being joined online on stream by lots of people from the National Theatre of Scotland. They're very excited about seeing Maureen tonight. And finally, we've got Paul Fleming, who's the industrial organiser for theatre at Equity, and he's currently running to be the general secretary of Equity, and he's endorsed by the Union Council, which I assume means that Maureen is supporting him, so there won't be any internal animosity tonight. So thanks all for coming. So we're just going to get some opening remarks from some of the guests before we go into questions. So I'd like to start with Tracy.
Well, wow, I didn't expect so many people to come on to the Zoom. I mean, it is Saturday night, but thanks ever so much for coming. And also great to see so many friends and colleagues on this Zoom. Well, we're here because we're in an existential crisis in our industry. I would say that we are the least understood because of our portfolio careers, potentially the least supported, and we are the most impacted and will be the last to return because of social distancing. Speaking to of all the sectors that are under my remit, it is incredibly worrying, and certainly theatres are talking about going back January next year. That is very worrying because the furlough arrangements, we've only got 3 months of it currently. It's really important that we support freelancers and the self-employed in our sector, not just for the next 3 months, but until the business and the industry gets back to normal. And of course, you all know theatres have closed, comedy clubs, pubs, cinemas, studios have stood down. All of those freelancers and the self-employed are now looking at diaries that are completely empty. There are a number of people that are still, even though we've been pressing on a daily basis for support for individuals, there are still some people who are slipping through the net. I'd just very quickly like to thank Bector and Equity and the Writers Guild and the other trade unions around this sector that have done amazing work, working with myself and others, trying to get the government to understand who we are and how we operate. But there are still new starters aren't supported. We've got limited companies still concerned about their dividends. It seems that that's going to be sorted. That's the rumblings. We've also got those on under 50% PAYE contracts. And we all know, don't we, musicians may teach in the day, but they gig at night. So they've got that sort of portfolio career. And I'm also very concerned about mums on maternity leave or pregnant who have lost contracts and then may not be able to go back because of maternity. It is quite a confused picture. It's moving quite fast, but I would say it was initially very, very troubling, but we pushed and pushed, and on March 26th, we managed to get the government to give us a bit of support. Talking to the Society of London Theatres, it's really worrying that they did a massive survey and only 80% of their audience feel confident in booking tickets again. So of course, that's all music festivals all of the summer. That's running into literary festivals in the autumn. I'm really concerned that we might lose Panto, and Panto is the real lifeline for so many theatres and so many actors, particularly in musicians, because you do lots of shows and you can earn quite well, and that can see you through until, you know, February and March the following year. So it's really worrying that social distancing could have really big impact. Now, I know in South Korea and the Netherlands, they're back up and running. I don't know, you know, looking at their models, how they're making any money because of, you know, the impact of social distancing. But looking at the whole session today is about hearing from you and what you think needs to be in place, and what our green shoots could potentially be. I heard today that the ENO is doing drive-in opera. Secret Cinema have also got plans to do drive-in shows. You know, is that a way that we can rebuild and try and get back to some sort of good health? It is really worrying. And certainly when I put a call out for freelancers to tell me their stories, nearly 4,000 people contacted me, and I created a dossier called COVIDs and Creatives, and I'd be very happy to share that with everyone here. You will recognize so many themes of the seismic nature of this shutdown. I know there's lots of people who want to speak, and I really want to take questions, so I won't speak for much longer, but just to say it's really worrying. But having been a freelancer for over 3 decades, I absolutely get it. The feast and famine nature of our job, the desire to do our job because we absolutely love it, but also the fear of not being able to pay the mortgage, not being able to pay your bills, or even put food on the table when you've fallen through the net of support. And with universal credit absolutely creaking at the seams, it's a very worrying time for our sector.
Thanks, Tracy. We'll get some perspectives from Tom next, and then we'll bring Maureen and Ian in. So, Tom, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. I think it's mostly obvious what's happening, but maybe it'd be, you know, helpful to clarify how the commercial musicians make money, because I think that often gets lost in everything else. My sector, we don't really get any arts funding. Traditionally, we never have. The assumption is we'll fight for ourselves and, you know, we'll do okay. The thing is that, you know, live music is gone, as Tracy said. Venues are closed, and even more so than theatre, I think that the idea of people standing shoulder to shoulder, sweating on each other in a black box, is quite a lot further away than people sitting in a nice theatre on chairs. And the disincentive and the, you know, I just think we were in a really difficult situation there, and I don't think it's going to happen quicker for us than other sectors in any respect. And the festivals are gone already. So the live's gone, and we have no idea of how long it's going to take to come back. Obviously, that's the venues. I don't know how they're going to get through. Obviously, there has been support for them. But for musicians, we are then in a situation around what have we got left? We have recorded music, which and we have royalties. And unfortunately, most of our royalties come through PROs, like PRS and PPL. And that money comes from licensing to business premises. And what's closed down? All of the businesses. So another leg of how we stay afloat is gone. And musicians don't make a lot of money, and that we really need to deal with. That's always been a big problem, is people's sort of perception of people making money, especially young people in pop these days. They're nothing like the earners of the 80s and 90s. I mean, very, very, very far from it. Most of them are doing it out of the love these days. So you come back to what's left, which is recorded music, and recorded music is a very messy and unhelpful way for a lot of musicians to make money. Songwriters were already in deep trouble before COVID happened, because streaming is such a very poor payer. It pays very badly for the song. So there are all kinds of problems in that world that are that needed to be dealt with anyway, but now the pressure of it feels incredibly strong. And, you know, that's what I've been talking about a lot on Twitter. I should say, actually, I've also been a member of the Labour Party for 28 years. So that's something else that should go on the CV. Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of sums it up. How we go through this, what that looks like. It's really, really terrifying for the most part. I'm not talking about just, you know, musicians who are jobbing band players who may have a teaching job as well, something like that. I'm talking about, you know, quite a lot of people who are just touring, basic, you know, your average middle of the road singer-songwriter who makes money every night from doing gigs, maybe gets a song on telly every now and again, you know. That they've slipped through so many nets. Most of them are limited companies, so there's just no money there, and there's nothing in sight, and it's desperate.
Okay, thanks, Tom. This is not going to be the world's happiest session, but we'll try and find some positives later. Maureen, do you want to come from a sort of acting perspective on this?
Well, I'm the president of Equity. We have just over 48,000 members now, and we cover not just performers of all kinds, dancers, singers, actors, street performers, circus. We cover clowning, mimes, audio artists. We have burlesque people, you know, all that. We cover it all. And we also cover stage managers, directors, designers of all kinds, lighting, sound, etc. So we really are we've got a big umbrella organization and are very, very aware of all the different problems. As Tracy said earlier, we're sort of such an ornery industry in that you can't go, oh, well, all right, great, you all do that, so we'll put you there and we'll give you some money for that. You know, so many people, and our staff have been absolutely incredible working, and every time they see something, oh, there's a person that's fallen through the cracks, immediately they get on it and find a way to talk to the government and HMRC about giving them money. But what Tom was saying there is so much of what you said, Tom, absolutely, you know, it resounds in our world as well. We're feeling exactly the same kinds of pressures. And one of the things that I feel about it, and then this is maybe the more positive side of it, and I don't want to be like Pollyanna, because it's really appalling what's happening out there. And like Tom's world, most of the people that we have in our industry, never mind our members, earn threepence halfpenny. You know, the average amount of earning of our members from the business is 10,000 quid a year. You know, it's nothing. And they're doing all these other jobs, which have also gone now because they're all in the cafes and the restaurants and the bars and all that. So it's a parlous state. But one of the things that we've been talking about, which I think is really possibly interesting, certainly in the short term, and of course live performance is the most difficult one, isn't it? Because is that we go back a bit and we look at the way that we used to make theatre. And I remember when I was in, I think probably my early 20s, the RSC, for example, went around with a tent. And they went around and they just put the tent up in a big field or a car park or wherever it was, wherever there was space. And they put up the seating that they took with them and they did shows. And the shows were technically very, very low key. There was very, very little, you know, we're so used now in a most wonderful way and we long for them to come back. The places like the Opera Houses and the National, the big theatres at the National, where the technology is amazing. I mean, the Olivier stage, for example, you know, is like having 14 other characters on on stage with you. So all that, but maybe we need to go back. We still want the directors and designers and people to come up with, but maybe to come up with a different idea of how that will look. And we want, absolutely, the most important thing for us is that the workers, whatever new way we go forward, is that we go back to with the workers being at the absolute center of it and being honored and respected for what they bring, and that we do not lose out in terms of what we're, the hard fought battles for our terms and conditions, that we do not find ourselves going, oh yes, right enough, you don't have any money because you've had that terrible time, you haven't been able to open your business, so we'll take the hit for you. Absolutely not. We are not going to let that happen. It's incredibly important. So just to finish off, one of the things that I think is a big thing that we're trying to do, because obviously the past couple of months has been absolutely about short term, get the money, trying to protect people. Then looking forward, I'm going to bring a motion to Equities Council at the end of this month, which is about finding support to set up a creative commission, because I think that equity is absolutely perfectly set to be the place where we can bring all the different influences and all the different people with all their amazing ideas. We're an incredibly resilient industry. The people are full of imagination. That's what we do for a living. And we can talk to the engagers, we can talk to the audiences, we can talk to our members, and we can come up with a real plan of action. And that will also, of course, include an all-member survey to just say, not please help us, we need to know how to do this, but we've got to listen to the people in the industry and get their ideas from us, because people are coming up with great ideas. And I think we can go forward. And I really genuinely believe it can be fabulously exciting.
Thank you. Thanks, Maureen. I'm going to bring Ian in last. And I think, Ian, you can bring two perspectives to this. One from the video games side, but another one also as the chair of the National Video Games Museum, about museums and the struggle of museums, and maybe a slightly different perspective from the video games industry. So over to you, Ian.
All right, thank you. Hello, everybody. It's, well, paradoxically, the video games industry is in a relatively good position. Usually the games industry is seen as a kind of the sort of the stepchild of the creative industries, always viewed with some suspicion, and yet it's been a great British success story. 2,000 studios in the UK. We really punch above our weight in content creation. Some of the biggest franchises in the world have been created in the UK, from Grand Theft Auto 5, which generated $1 billion in 3 days of revenue in 2013, to Tomb Raider and a whole host of games that people are familiar with. And it's been, paradoxically successful during the current pandemic, because the games industry transitioned its business model some years ago from physical product sold at a premium price at retail to a digital service, often free at the point of delivery. And whilst other industries in the physical media and obviously live performance has struggled, of course, in the pandemic, it's kind of almost business as usual for the games industry currently. Revenues are up globally. I think most people have seen the phenomenon of and success of games like Animal Crossing that give people comfort during this crisis. And but not just about the consumption, the creativity. Developers and studios, their staff are able to work from home, remote working, as they use cloud-based development systems and development kits in the home to create content. So I'm also chairman of Sumo Group in Sheffield. We have nearly 800 people scattered around the UK and also in India and Canada. And it's impacted perhaps slightly in terms of deliver the content to budget, and not to budget, to schedule. But other than that, the games industry has fared well. Now, ironically, the old world, I was to say, I was co-founder of Games Workshop back in the 1970s. Games Workshop, I'm no longer associated with Workshop. I sold out in the early 1990s. But if you see what's happened with Workshop, all their retail stores are now closed because, again, this is physical games. So there's a great disparity between physical and digital in the way things are created and the way things are consumed. And I think post-COVID, the new normal will be a new networked community for for work in many ways, and also for consumption. So the games industry really ticks all the right boxes for a post-COVID digital economy: high tech, high skills, instant export story, 90% export story on day one. Regional, doesn't have to be in London. Most game studios are outside of London, and IP generating. So intellectual property and intangible asset, but hugely valuable. What started as sketch with Lara Croft became a multi-billion-dollar franchise. So I think the perception of digital industries are going to change quite a lot, particularly the games industry. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that the World Health Organization was criticizing the games industry. And now they're saying amazing things about the industry because they're giving comfort and connecting people. I mean, talking about music, I don't know if you saw in Fortnite recently, there are millions of people playing Fortnite. Travis Scott had a party inside Fortnite. There were 12 million concurrent people inside Fortnite enjoying that content. So from a physical point of view, in terms of the National Video Games Museum in Sheffield, it's been quite a terrible time. Suddenly 80% of our income was lost overnight, and we were faced with the challenge whether to close the museum, maybe close the charity, the BGI, or do something instantly with it. So we reached out, we were very proactive. We put in place a Just Giving campaign. We set a target of £80,000, and we've blown through that over £130,000, because I think people are beginning at last to understand the cultural impact of games. It's not just about people locked in rooms. Games have really brought people together in many ways. There's a social impact, there's a cultural impact, and of course there's an economic impact. And if people can get over their prejudice against one or two titles and think cognitively what happens when people play in a game, problem solving, creativity in games like Minecraft, learning in context, you can fail in a safe environment, you're encouraged to play again. There's so many good things about the power of play, and I'd like to see more industries try and adapt the working practices and the way that the games industry has adapted and transitioned from a physical goods to digital goods. Of course, that's impossible in many industries and many professions, but I think there's a lot to learn from the business operations of games that can help all the creative industries.
Great. So I've got three questions I'm going to ask, and I'm going to ask the people on the panel to answer. I know we're losing Ian at 8:30, so I'm going to actually, after that, I'm going to bring a question in from Armin, who's a big fan, before we lose you, Ian. So I'll go on to my first question, which is, which has been touched upon really by everybody, particularly in the last one, that our habits have changed and have been forced to change by the lockdown. Are there any positives for the future? So I'm thinking about things like the increased use of digital platforms. The National Theatre have introduced their home service for productions. They've had big viewing figures. Is there something here we can learn about trying to get culture that might at the moment not be very accessible to be more accessible for others? Maybe, because Lisa hasn't spoken yet, if Lisa, would you like to respond to that one first? And I'll bring Paul in, who hasn't spoken yet, and then Simon, and then we'll come back to the people that have spoken. Lisa, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's a little bit early to talk about silver linings when we're in the heat of this and people are still losing their relatives. However, from our point of view, the breaking of the obsession of dragging everybody down to London for meetings at huge expense, we think that's a very positive thing at the Writers Guild, particularly for our members who are writers with disabilities, writers with caring responsibilities, and writers who, frankly, might have the money to pay to go from Leeds to London. I can speak from experience at huge expense, or a very early start in the morning if you get the megabus. So that's a positive thing. I think it's a little bit early to tell about whether how we consume culture will change. I think there's been an initial flurry of things online, which I think has been amazing. I think the BBC has certainly cemented in the national. And I think any talk in Parliament about getting rid of it needs to be stopped immediately. It's shown, public service broadcasting has shown its worth. But I think for theatre, it literally isn't the same, and there's only so much of that you can watch, and it's not a true theatre experience, in my opinion. I think the desire to get back to something that is a truly live experience will become overwhelming, and I certainly feel for the musicians, because I think you're right. I think there's a huge difference between sitting in lovely seats at the Leeds Playhouse and throwing yourself around at the Broodnell Social Club. It's two different things. We should fight to make sure that both of those things come back. But yes, I think the realization that we can work without an obsession of dragging people down, a little less ableism, I think will be a definite positive outcome from this.
That's great, Lisa. It's something I hadn't thought about. We lost you a little bit there. I think me, you and Simon are all using the same broadband in Leeds, and that's all of Leeds' broadband used up. But I'll come on to Paul for that and see if there's anything from an equity perspective that actually there might be something for the future from the increased use of digital platforms that we're seeing.
I mean, I think Maureen and Lisa have both summed it up really. I mean, in as much as it reflects the potential for the unlocking of other revenue streams for our members. I mean, we are having those active conversations now. This is work done. This is work that people need to be compensated for in order to make sure that there's an industry there in the future as we move forward. And I think that is a really big area of constructive potential. Anything that gets more money into the pockets of precarious working people is a good thing. And I think if there is going to be anything that comes out of the crisis that is positive for the workforce in particular, is that it's created this enormous question mark over the way in which our industry has been funded, supported and structured by the government. And what you see is, I mean, you know, I've been liking to use the analogy recently of like a steelworks. You know, you can't turn a steelworks off. If you do, sort of bits of it crack, the product finishes at the end, the whole system collapses. And indeed, the steel industry wants £500 million worth of support. Well, the structure that they've set up in the entertainment industry is identical. If you look at the French, or if you look at the models in Spain, or if you look at the models in Holland, what you're seeing is either through universal basic income, or because theatres are not dependent on ticket sales, because they get adequate subsidy, they're not dependent on bar sales, they're not dependent on their restaurant, they're not dependent on corporate gigs, or you know, you have schools that have the arts and culture integrated into them. You know, there's a lot of our members working in independent, small-scale children's theatre that are very worried about, you know, children having so much time away from the classroom. Culture seen as a nice bit of an add-on. What's going to happen to that sector of work after the lockdown? Actually, those are frightening things, but they're very good things as well. What they show is that this system cannot continue. We can't go back to business as usual. We have to have a different complex for how this industry is supported. And that's not just the public sector. We're going to, you know, a big publicly funded institution had a conversation with the union 48 hours after the lockdown started in theatre, which was essentially the 16th of March, saying we have enough money to last 10 weeks. Enough money to last 10 weeks. That is how bad the situation is. But it can't go on like that, because this is going to go on for longer than 10 weeks. This is going to go on longer than 6 months. This is going to go on for over a year for our industry. And the government's going to have to step up. They're going to have to step up when it comes to the commercial sector. They're going to have to step up when it comes to the subsidised sector. But most crucially, you can mothball a theatre, but you can't mothball people. They're going to have to come up for a better support network, a better structure to support the precarious artists who work, whether they be writers, actors, directors, you know, stage management, whoever they are. There's going to have to be a really serious reevaluation, because otherwise, after the lockdown, there won't be an industry to come back to. And that's frightening, but actually I think it is quite positive. We've proved our worth. We've shown the value of public sector broadcasting, of the big regional institutions. Well, do you want them to survive, or don't you? And that is the question that really has to be asked of the government, because if they're not funding artists and institutions properly, you're not going to have.
Thanks, Paul. I just want to say that those reflect the sort of conversation we're having in our shadow team, which Tracy is leading. So you'll be pleased to hear that. I can't speak for Oliver Dowden and his team though. Simon, I was coming on to you. You had a little bit of a hit on YouTube recently with Oh My God, where you did a version, a lockdown version of Oh My God. It's got over 200,000 views on YouTube now, I believe. So you obviously, used to the digital platforms and have maybe made use of them in this time. So what do you think? How do you think that might affect musicians?
I think it wasn't really for monetary value or anything like that in our particular case, but I think it's up to artists, as always, to try and be a bit clever and try and work out ways they can do things differently. I want to reiterate some of the stuff that already got said. Like for me personally, probably 95% of my income is from touring live. If I don't leave my house, I don't really make any money. I make a little bit of stuff here and there, but and the reason for that, I think, is because over time, it's a weird thing where you can't get people to buy a CD for 10 quid, 8 quid, 7 quid, whatever they cost now. But you can get them to buy a ticket for 50 quid, for 150 quid for a festival or whatever, because the live experience is the thing that is irreplaceable and is the thing that everybody wants. So without that, and I think, as people said before, maybe people might go back to theatres, like emptier theatres first or cinemas and things like that. But in terms of a gig, it's been hot and sweaty and full is sort of part of the experience. So it needs to be that. So that's a shame. But as I say, I think the answer is to, number one, is connect with the fans, people that like your band, which obviously the problem with that is for new and aspiring, people who are up and coming who haven't got a fan base yet. How can they possibly generate one? Like I know quite a few like younger bands who were, doing things this summer. Were playing at Bingley Fest and they had an EP release, to go with that or whatever, and all that's in the bin. And then the other thing I think, which is what Tom was saying, I think, is sort of having a look at the deals that have been done on, maybe paying a little bit more for recorded music and, giving artists I think people think, like Tom was saying, that we're all on yachts a la the 80s, but the amount of money you get from like selling a CD or a download or whatever is quite small unless you go direct D2C or whatever. And even things like, just because Ian was talking about games and films, used to be a really good source of money. I have a friend who wrote some music for video games and did extremely well out of it. But that mark, nowadays, if you get a sync on a video game, it's not really, it's money and it's good. And I think great for aspiring bands and things like that, where you get that's a real stepping stone and can make a real big difference. But compared to live fees, it's nothing really.
Thanks, Sam. So moving on from that, obviously live is so important for everybody, and visitor attractions for the museum set as well. It's about footfall, it's about people having that interaction. So what will a phased reopening mean for the venues and for the artists and the actors? And if those venues have to have social distancing, how do you think that might affect things? So does that mean in some cases it wouldn't work at all, or will social distancing work in some places and not others? Maybe if Tracy, maybe you'd like to start us off on that one.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly difficult, because not only is it about the actual show or performance, it's also about the marketing, the casting, the preparation beforehand. So you need to have your full team in place, for example, in a theatre, in order to market a show, cast a show, get the set built, costumes and so on. So that you're at full whack and paying salaries for something that is actually not generating any income currently. So it is very much a catch-22 situation. Now, I know that talking to the UK Music and the Musicians Union, it may be that music is how we start our sort of return. So you could have an open air venue, like a big car park, and have a 45-minute gig, people very aware of social distancing. It's tough because people just want to be together, don't they? So maybe that's a way forward, or smaller theatres where, you know, it's every other seat. But talking to producers, it does seem that the only way a show can actually be financially viable is if you sell a full house and you get as much capacity as possible. And like I mentioned in my opening remarks, you know, Secret Cinema, the ENO are doing in-car experiences. So you could attract attention with your lights. There could be social distancing on the way to the toilets. But I do think, you know, it's incredibly difficult. And if I could just pick up about the monetizing the online culture in quarantine, which I think has been fantastic. And like you say, the BBC has really proved itself, but also other organizations as well. The Theatres Hampstead's been doing great stuff, the National, others on YouTube, drama schools and so on. They've all sort of risen to the challenge, but those artists aren't getting paid. So whilst, you know, it's great to see this content, it is being given away. And talking to those that, you know, I thought maybe we could make shows that go online initially. It's almost impossible to make the economics work because you'd have to pay the artists. And as soon as you start that, then you can't actually get enough money because whilst the content is currently free, there is an opportunity to donate. And there is very little donating going on when you've watched One Man, Two Governors or whatever. It is often those who normally go to the theatre who are donating. But one exciting thing is that the 55.6% of a survey of 1,000 people in the Northeast have been accessing content they've never seen before. People have never been to a play, are watching plays online or on television. People have going around a gallery, going to the Battersea Arts Centre, looking on their offering. You know, they're doing things that they never have. So we need to capture that audience and say, when we're going forward, that's going to be a new audience we need to reach out to, who may never, because of caring responsibilities or finances or whatever, may never go to a theatre locally.
So following up that, Maureen and Paul, what are your members saying to you about returning to work at the theatre and the prospect of potential social distancing?
Will I say something first, Paul?
Yep.
Well, it's desperate. They're desperate to get back. You know, you said earlier on, Tracy, you know, that is, and yourself as well, Alex, you know, it's not just about the feeding your body. Of course, that's incredibly important, and we know that, but it's also about feeding the soul. And it's, you know, what we do for a living is we feed people's souls, and we you know, the importance of the arts cannot be overstated here. And people are missing it vastly. You know, somebody, you were talking about, you know, live music. Of course, I talked to a friend at a 2-meter distance at the park the other day, and he said to me, he was almost weeping. He said, I miss live music so much. It was his big thing, going somewhere and listening to things. So it's really, really important. And to pick up Paul's point, you know, the government have got to get behind this. And this whole idea of, you know, you get a company together and there's all this sort of stuff going on around it to put a production on, and the model doesn't work because you can only have, for instance, what's been talked about is, you know, one person every 3 seats or whatever it is. Well, one of the reasons for that is, well, there's 2 reasons. One of the reasons is because the productions cost such a vast amount of money at the moment. And I don't see why we can't go back to something simpler in the meantime. Some of the most exciting things I have ever seen in live performance have been the simplest things. Something going up close inside, you know, in Edinburgh during the festival, and 1 or 2 people standing in a darkened room chatting to each other, electrifying, you know. But that linked with a government really getting behind the arts and remembering that, I think it's, I can't, Paul will keep me right, but it's something like for every £1 you pay, you spend on the arts, you get 2 to 7 quid back. I mean, that is, I know that's different now because of the coronavirus and people are staying in and all that sort of thing, but I think we have to remember those things. So that's what yeah.
Thanks, Maureen. Do you want to add to that, Paul?
Yeah, just briefly, it's a couple of things. It goes back to the failure of the government's model for how theatre works. So if you look at the way that, as I understand it, the French are talking about reopening their theatres, they're not dependent on income from bars to reopen a theatre because they're all adequately subsidised. So actually you can open a theatre very safely for the audience with lots of space around them because they don't need that income. If you look at some cities in Spain that are looking at staggering live performance events of an evening to restrict the amount of people on public transport, doesn't matter, because the artists are receiving some form of basic income, and actually you can kind of prorate, you can stagger, you can move things around. You know, in countries that have adequately provided for its theatre, for the revenue going into those theatres, you can reopen your industry earlier and more safely. In this instance, we're talking about producers who essentially, if you have even a big West End theatre, if you're only opening it at 50% capacity max, and indeed having to regulate people come in and out, can't open the bar because that space is so crushed together, how on earth can you make any level of reasonable profit? That means we're denying audiences experiences to go into the theatre, and we're denying our members the ability to safely go back to work. And that, I think, is the other thing as well. The thing that terrifies me most is that the government's approach to rolling back the lockdown will not take into account people's portfolio careers in this industry. So you can roll back furlough quite easily on an industry by industry basis, but what happens to the self-employed scheme? The self-employed scheme, they haven't even confirmed for how long it's going to last. Our members have portfolio careers where that self-employed income replacement is being made up from working, you know, as a yoga instructor, as a carpenter, as a plasterer, as well as being an actor or a member of stage management or whatever. But if you roll that back, when does that end? And actually, I don't want our members being frightened to return to work because it's unsafe, but have to do so because they have no other income. And that is a really, really big worry about the way the government has implemented this self-employed scheme, which means that we are, it's not just about audience safety, it's about the safety of those people in those workplaces. Equity members, but dressers, you know, Bectu members, those people who automatically have to be in very close contact with the public. How are they going to be protected? And how will they be protected if the government says, well, we'll let you go back to theatres, but the economics of it doesn't make sense? I'm really worried there's going to be a huge gap between when government support ends and when the industry can afford to reopen. And it goes back to that thing I've said before. Does the government want the industry to survive this crisis or not? If it does, it's going to have to put money into it, money into its workforce and money into its institutions.
Thanks. So similar one to you, Tom. Would you know, concert venues, phased reopening, social distancing? I can imagine going to Brixton Academy or King Tut's. I can't imagine the social distancing gig in venues like that.
I'm desperate for. I mean, these, even if we do manage to have sort of outdoor social distanced gigs, it's, you know, how it'll get a few musicians playing again. Great, but we have, you know, it's interesting to talk about this, but you know, the endemic problems in my industry are to do with the fact that we digitized 20 years ago, right? So you're all talking about digitization, like, whoa, look, we're all going digital. Like, we went fully digital so long ago, and trust me, it's not worked out well. It has not worked out well. You leave it in the powers of the global entertainment conglomerates, and you don't regulate them, and you put your hands up in the air every time they do something else awful to all of the creatives. And everyone just goes, oh, you know, it is what it is. And we've been crushed and crushed and crushed to the point where you have a billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar streaming industry and no creatives to speak of who are doing particularly well out of it, apart from a very, very small few. So for me, it's like the answers to this problem aren't how do we get back into live so that I can save our bacon again, because it isn't happening anytime soon. It's just not happening. I wish it was, but it's not. So the bigger question for me is, how do we talk about sustainability now? What does sustainability mean for the arts, and the way that it interacts with business and commerce, especially in my area, which is fully commercial and has no support, very little support from the government, if any. How do we look again at how companies form social contracts with the people that they employ, the people that their content providers? You know, where is the social contract there? You know, that for me would be the biggest thing to come out of this, would be to say, well, we have to give you sustainability. We can't just take your stuff and throw it out into the world. You know, YouTube, 200,000 plays on YouTube probably made Simon's band about 10p, literally about 10p. I'm not even joking. I'm not overestimating. That's probably how much money that actually generated, is 10 pence. So you know, we're in a very different place, and it's thrown a very, very big light on it. And yeah, so I want to talk to you about how we're going to get people back in live spaces, but I'm just utterly clueless to what the answer is. I just
Okay.
don't.
We'll come back to your wider issue in a bit. I know you're keen to talk
Sure.
about it. So before I ask my last question, I'm going to bring a young man in who's really keen to ask Ian a question. I know Ian's got to go in about 10 minutes. Then we'll come back to my last question. So Armin, I'm going to unmute you, and then you can ask your question to Ian.
Sorry. Hey, Ian, just want to say I love the work that IDOS did while you were president. So great work on that. And also, of course, the gaming industry has also been very well in terms of a lot of people are playing video games. I was wondering, how will this pandemic and this lockdown would hit the actual console launch of the next gen? Of course, this holiday season, the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series, I don't know, the new Xbox will be released. I was wondering, how would this be affected? Would it be affected not at all? Would it maybe be delayed a little bit? Or would it just go, as planned? So that's what I was really wondering.
Well, I think you have to ask Microsoft and Sony about that. I'm not privy to their launch decisions. I personally would think they might get pushed back a bit, but that's not in the public domain yet. But getting back to the point about digitization and digital content, the games industry thing has enabled developers and creators to get a much greater lion's share of the revenues derived from their IP than when it was in the physical world. They used to be reliant on publisher funding and getting them a ride to market, but then having hopefully, if they'd earned out their development fees, to get a trailing revenue of royalties, but that often didn't happen. But now, because of the App Store, because of Steam, because of digital distribution, they can go direct to consumers, so they can monetize the whole world. So if you're a developer, no matter where you live, you can access every person effectively in the whole world through whatever digital device they play their games on, whether it's smartphones, PCs, consoles, or whatever. So I think there's an awful lot to learn from the game industry, and it's driven by technology, and therefore it's challenged, but also sees the opportunities and adapts very quickly to those changes in technology. And every new platform that's come, from PCs to consoles to smartphones to Facebook to VR to AR, these have been additive to the market. Whereas in music, the new formats have been rather usually substitutional. As you move from their physical media, from LPs to cassettes to CDs to streaming, that has not increased the market size. It's been a substitutional effect. So unless I don't know anything really about the music industry to have any valuable knowledge to say, but I could perhaps say should have conversations as a creative industry as a whole to understand from each other how we can help each other. The games industry does have a lot to offer in terms of technology, and after all, it is the poster child of the marriage of art and technology. We absolutely rely on art, and we absolutely reliant on artists and animators and story writers and cinematographers and musicians and everybody who crafts in digital formats. And we do entertain the world through games, and it is part of what we are as a 21st century citizen. It is the de facto games industry's de facto entertainment industry for the young people of today. So what I would like to see from a government is to enable much more digital creativity, from moving children in particular from consumption of games to being able to make games, from consumption to creativity, and encourage more of an entrepreneurial mindset, give them digital making skills to understand how they can actually make digital content, move from the passenger seat to the driver's seat of creativity. So any child, no matter how disadvantaged, if you give them digital making skills and entrepreneurial mindset, and allowed to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes, which you can when you're playing a game, you're not punished for making a mistake. You maybe can turn the sort of post-COVID kind of network world of children in particular to become digital entrepreneurs and turn them from being job seekers into job makers. But getting back to the game industry, you know, I do hope that those consoles come out soon, because I'm waiting for them for too soon.
Thanks. I think it's really interesting because the video games is probably alongside animation, probably encompasses all the other creatives really well, because you obviously have to have writers, you have to have animators and artists, you have to have musicians, and you have to have actors. So you are encompassed. So actually, I think there probably is a really important role for us in the Shadow Culture team to work with you to understand how we can roll some of those things out into the other industries, because you probably, even before film and music, video games were digitized because it's a digital platform. So I think that's really, really helpful. I know we're going to lose you soon, Ian, but we're going to, I think the next, I'm just going to ask a question which I think everybody can answer. And I'm going to read out a bit of an email actually from one of my constituents, because all of your industries, the talent, your creatives are all built on a whole range of other people. So I got this email yesterday from one of my constituents who says, I work as a touring rigger in the entertainment industry. I'm my own personal service company, which I'm the only direct contractor. I'm employed on an event-by-event basis in the theatre, television, and live event venues in the UK and around the world. So I think covers everybody here. In the short term, I'm not working. I have no work planned for the future. I have no income. I'm using my savings to live. My company is not eligible for government support in the long term, and I shall have to seek alternative employment, basically saying if these things don't turn around quickly. Aren't we facing a potentially catastrophic loss of people who support the creative industries if the government doesn't support us? I think probably Tracy's the person to start us off on that one, but I'll come to all of you. Tracy.
Yeah, it's incredibly depressing, because I was on a Zoom with lots of young Beck2 members, over nearly 300 Beck2 members, and there was an online poll, and 50%, over 50% have said they're thinking about leaving the sector. This is really worrying. I was co-chair of a report with Gloria Di Piero called the Acting Up Report, where we looked at the leaky pipeline for working class creatives getting into the industry. And we know that, you know, from that evidence, it's absolutely clear as day that COVID is going to impact on working class creatives more than others, because if you've got family money, if you live in London with your parents, you can sit it out and wait for this to go and you'll be okay. But if you're actually going hand to mouth, and you maybe have universal credit as well as some of your earnings as an actor or a musician or a writer, you are potentially going to look elsewhere now, because you're going to think it's not going to be up on its feet, the industry, until at least next year. How am I going to pay my bills? Of course, I've got to look for something else. And I do think once you're out of the sector, it's going to be very hard then to get back in and to keep those contacts. I'm very worried about agents going, and they are the ones also supporting young actors, you know, encouraging them, trying to find other ways for them to earn money. I'm also very worried about the production companies who are now saying to agents, tell me which of your performers have got equipment in their home that they can deliver content for us. So that is immediately splits our workforce into those that have the money to invest in their career, like get mics or a sound booth or a camera, you know, whatever, and those that don't have it, and those that are going to miss out on opportunities. It's deeply, deeply worrying.
Lisa, in terms of writers, I grew up on John Godber plays and Alan Bleasdale TV series. Are we going to potentially lose the next generation of working class writers?
We're certainly concerned about that, because we think that television particularly is going to have a bottleneck. Everything's on hold at the moment. And so people who, you know, have that rare thing of a guaranteed income in this industry have found their income has stopped. So the soap writers are desperate to get back to work, and other people are desperate to get back to work. So our concern is that there'll be a new conservatism when it comes to commissions, that television companies, theatre companies will fall back on their bankable writers' names. There's precious little bankable writers' names. We can all walk down the street and not get bothered if we're quite honest about it. But our concern is that the work that has been done to bring new writers, working class voices, BAME voices, writers with disabilities, the work we've done over the last 2 years in the Guild to make sure women get a fair crack of the whip when it comes to writing, we're really scared we're going to lose that. We'll fight tooth and nail to make sure that doesn't happen. And to sound a positive note, for a large part of the industry, we are very aware it comes down to us. So when the new guidelines come in for how many people you can have on a stage, how many people you can have in the Rovers for an episode of Coronation Street, all that kind of thing, it will be down to us as writers to come up with creative solutions for those problems that mean the industry can start to wind up again. And I think we're enormously lucky in this country that we have great creative talent. So on the unmonetary side, on the creative side, I have a very Pollyanna point of view about I think we're going to be okay, but we have to make sure there is government and monetary support there to make sure that nobody falls to the crap. We already had a skills gap in television, which is an industry that brings an enormous amount of money into the country. So we need to make sure those gaps don't widen.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Simon, all those people that support your band, the techies, the producers, the riggers, what are you hearing from them? And how can we help them as politicians? What can we do?
Sorry, I was just muted. I think that a lot of people who work in those sort of industries, like our guys, are sort of used to things being up and down, you know. So at the moment, the guys who work for us particularly are fine, but you know, long term, obviously that's not sustainable. Usually, if we were going to take a year off or something like that, they would go off and find other people to work with, but obviously they can't do that. And I think it goes back to something someone else was saying, where there's obviously self-employed, and so there is some support, but how long that will last for, how much it will be, when it can come, you know, when it will arrive, and all those other things. I think are big question marks. I was going to say, I wrote that down really, that, yeah, I think it might be that someone was talking about theatres opening at, you know, 50% or whatever, and it being harder to make money. But I think actually what's important is like the community aspect. So for me personally, you know, maybe the theatres have to open and they only pay the staff and no one's making any profit. Do you know what I mean? But you are giving some people some jobs for a little while. Maybe, you know, you've got to be all in it together for a little bit. So that's it.
Great. I'm going to bring some of the audience in now, and I'm going to bring Neil Nerver in, who's a councillor. We've got a few councillors on this call, and a London Assembly member who wants to ask a question about what councils can do. I'm going to bring Ian in from a museum perspective. I know he has a view on this because we've talked about it. So Neil, what's your question about what councils can do?
Well, very simply, I mean, what can we be doing as councillors, and what are like the 3 asks you've got for us to be working on?
Thanks, Neil.
We've got all sorts. We've got to demonstrate that we prioritise culture. We feel really short of money, really hard done by, massive pressure on social care. 3 reasons why in Labour Group we can be saying culture comes first.
Ian, you chair a museum. What can councils do for the museum sector?
Well, I must say Sheffield has been really supportive for the MVM, really helping support us in numerous ways, working with our landlords, trying to find small grants, giving guidance on how to look after the staff. It's great to be involved with the council at a very, very close level. It's been tough for the MVM, but we've managed to push through by appealing to the world through a very successful Just Giving. But I fear for museums in general, there could be a sort of Darwinian extinction of museums unless there is much more proactive help from the government. I know that the councils are trying to do as much as they can, but it requires government to step in and and make a major difference into the amount of support that can be offered to museums. The problem with the MVM is that we don't get public funding. Whilst it's a charity, we were going through an accreditation process. So I'd maybe like to also see the council's appeal to Arts Council of England, perhaps, as they bring some additional funding to the MVM, because it wasn't accredited, it wasn't allowed to apply for emergency funding for COVID. But I think that it's important that all museums work closely with their local council, because the councils do an extraordinary job.
Thanks. Paul, what about from your perspective, from Equity for theatres particularly, what can council anything to support theatres?
So I mean, I think from our perspective, a really helpful thing for our members and a kind of good reference point for councillors is in 2018. The union ran a campaign in London, led by our London branches, with 5 key asks of every London council, and we got parties of all different shades to sign up to those. But key to those, and I think this is going to be more key emerging from the coronavirus crisis than ever before, is that when you engage professional artists, you engage them on a union rate. Now, when it is and you know, the Arts Council, or all arts councils, I should say, in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, require, when producers are budgeting for them to, and applying for public funding, to budget at industry standard. And by industry standard, what they mean are the standard negotiated national agreements for the relevant sector. Why should public money from a local council be any different? And councils can get a little bit trigger happy with the idea of providing a level of, an amount of culture, a volume of culture, rather than actually supporting the local people, whether they be performers, stage management, directors, designers, writers, whoever they are, that are part of it. But those 5 key demands that we had from our 2018 local election campaign in London have a lot of national applicability to them, and it's all about supporting that grassroots talent and making sure that people can afford to live in the profession that they've done. And there's a lot of talk from local authorities who do really, really great stuff. I should disclose for absolute transparency, I am actually a Labour councillor, completely disconnected from my equity work as well. So it is something I'm particularly passionate about. But you know, if we're not having a position, if we don't have, local councils are the largest funders of culture in the country, but if they're not funding that workforce and they're not funding it in a fair and equal way, you know, their credentials, when they talk about being a living wage borough or a living wage authority, really have to be called into question. So I think that I think is the biggest thing emerging from this. There should be sources of quality employment for our members.
May I say something, Alex?
Yeah, go on, come in, Tracy.
Thank you. Primarily, what I would like to see is an arts centre in every community, and if that is the library, then please, all councils, just keep your libraries open, because that's where your poetry is happening. That's where young people for the first time are experiencing some sort of culture in the room upstairs in the library. We need those common spaces, because the village hall or the town hall, those spaces are now being closed down because they're expensive to maintain. We need those public buildings to be open to all, and the opening hours extended. All of my libraries seemingly are run by volunteers. We need that support, so to bring that ambition and a creative sort of vision for libraries, how you can exploit that. Also, if you haven't got creative people and places in your community, please do investigate it, because it's an arts funded scheme where high level, top quality culture is grown out of communities, and it upskills a community that's not used to accessing culture, and also enables people then to go on to jobs in the arts and creativity. It's an amazing scheme for those communities that don't normally take interest in culture. Also, can I say as well, councils, every council should have a film location button on their website, because look what location hunting has done for Halifax. everybody now goes to Halifax when they want to film in the north. We know that you get a location, you know, you get a film crew come to town, and you suddenly, your hotels benefit, your cab drivers benefit, your restaurants benefit, your local extras and crew benefit. I mean, what Ackley Bridge has done is, you know, these regional productions are really important for the economy locally. So if you haven't got a film office or someone designated to be a conduit between the film industry and the council, and making it as easy as possible so permits are easy and people can come and have a really warm welcome, I think that's a great way to build the cultural economy.
Thanks, Tracy. I'm going to bring Rona Topaz in now. I had a question about digitisation, which I think is really the big challenge here. And I'm going to bring Tom in this to answer, because he's not promoted his campaign yet. So I want to give him an opportunity to do that. So Rona.
Hi. My question was really to put to the panel, but I asked Simon privately about the monetization of online performances. Also, Paul said something rather curious. He said that he was involved with the Labour Party, which was separate from his work with the two should be intertwined. If you're doing work with your trade union, it should be intertwined with Labour, because Labour came up from the trade unions originally. But what I wanted to ask the panel was about monetizing live performances. I got some really good information from Simon, but I'm just wondering if anyone else had any ideas about how to make money from online live performances.
So I'm going to bring Tom in. So you're running this Broken Record campaign because the artists, as we know, get very little money. The labels get a reasonable amount of money, but still not very much. And it's really the streaming companies that are making the money, but we as consumers aren't really paying enough, are we, as well? So there's a big structural problem here, Tom, and how do we solve it?
It's a very good question. How do you solve a very, very big problem that involves lots and lots of rights holders, multinational companies of varying different descriptions? The truth is that the major labels, Universal, Sony and Warner Brothers, were allowed to grow so big by competition authorities around the world that they are, I mean, Universal own 30% of all recorded music at this moment in history. And nobody seems to have a good explanation for why that's been allowed to happen, because it's crazy, because it's so self-evidently the creation of a monopoly. But they are able to basically, because all they do is aggregate data and aggregate money as little tiny bits of billions of lines of data, because they own so much, they can keep making money forever. They're fine. They can sit pretty, as can the streaming companies who have who do the same thing. And in fact, the truth is that many of those labels will actually be making more than the streaming companies off of that money. That's from major labels, because of the pre-21st century deals that related to analog music actually put artists on something like 18% or 17% of the total. So you'll find that actually the major labels on a lot of the music that you really love are earning about 40 to 45% of all of the streaming money, whereas Spotify are only getting 30%. So don't think that, don't fall into the trap of thinking the DSPs are just the bad guys in this. They're really not. So, you know, the big problem we have, songwriters, for instance, we don't think about songwriters, but songwriters is a whole profession in and of itself. The songwriter can never get more than the tiniest little amount of money off of that tiny amount of money. And that's not allowed to be varied. We're not allowed to ask for more. It's not like we're in a disintermediated industry like the games industry, where we can just say, well, I'm worth this, give me more. We can't have any more than that, because there's nothing to allow us to do that. The rights have already been delineated, and we're not allowed any more. So at some point, we have to come back to the negotiating table, and these rights need to be completely reconsidered, because it doesn't work. And if anything like this ever happens, You know, it was unsustainable anyway. And what's really funny is, you know, we already had a problem with working class kids not getting into music anymore, precisely because of this, because you can't get off the ground. It's been a barrier to entry for ages, and we haven't been talking about it enough. It's been really hard. I've seen from when I started in the mid to late 90s, most of my peers were like me, from sort of low middle class backgrounds. Maybe one of our parents was a public servant or what, you know. But now I look at all the kids who I meet who are in bands, and they are posh. I don't want to avoid the word. They're posh, and you know, in the bank of mum and dad and all that, and that's been allowed to happen already. So the genie, I mean, in so many ways in my industry, I mean, I disagree with you about digitization as well. You know, the first digital record was recorded in 1979, right? It was recorded in 1979, and we were the first industry where everything was sold digitally. You still had to buy a video game in a case when you could buy music over the internet every day of the week. We are the sort of absolute case study in what happens if you don't look at the creator position and just allow sort of big disruptive industries to just run roughshod over everything. And you know, to what that I'm not sure who asked the question, but there's all kinds of problems with earning money from digital gigs, because you know, you might be able to do it to a certain extent, but presently, in lots of ways, that the licensing doesn't even exist properly. It's just not in place. So we're having all kinds of conversations at PRS at the moment. There's all these people using Twitch to do DJ sets, and you know, all of these different things going on, but there's no actual payment system in place to get money extracted from Twitch back to the people who wrote the music that the DJs are playing in their live, exciting Twitch session. So that money is just not going anywhere. And yet again, they've got us over a barrel, because who wants to go up against Amazon in a negotiation? It's always music is what music is a perfect example of what happens when you have unbalanced negotiation, and you allow it to happen in an unprotected way. Giant behemoths, multi-billion-dollar companies, songwriters, we just get crushed every single time. We can't win.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Rona. Thank you. I mean, there's nothing new, is it, Tom? Because you know, I remember Prince and the Warner Brothers contract and his refusal to record anything for years. Lisa, for writers, is this an issue as well with the Netflix and Amazon Prime era?
Certainly the big streaming companies did ride into town like it was the Wild West and try and take everything. We've been lucky that we have a couple of industry bodies that we can negotiate with and get to Netflix, etc. through them. So we are in the process of having those negotiations. The problem is they want all the rights forever and ever for 50p and a bag of gobstoppers, and obviously we're trying to negotiate them up from that. The biggest thing is the intellectual property, and making sure that just like Amazon has with music, just like the big music companies have, they don't end up with all the rights to all our work forever and ever, so they can show it until the cows come home. So that's under negotiation. I think that actually there's been a realization that it's unsustainable. I think the example that's been shown by music has shown it's fairly unsustainable for writers and actors and producers and directors. There is a concern that British companies will just become producers for hire, and the Americans will have a big influence over what we produce, but that is up for discussion at the moment. But certainly, very quickly, they'll have a very long conversation about guidelines for writers' work being used digitally in this emergent time. So yeah, just like you're seeing the DJ sets, we're seeing a lot of people doing monologues and readings and things online and thinking, well, the writer's not made any money from that. But that's something to be discussed as we go along.
May
Okay,
I say
great.
something about this,
Yeah,
Alex?
come in, Maureen. Yeah.
Just to reiterate, it's really interesting that so many themes are coming out which we all share. And one of the things that's happening in our side of the thing is that theatres are, you know, the sharks were circling and going, gosh, look at that. You've got a really beleaguered workforce who are desperate to work. We could buy that theatre and we could get that beleaguered workforce in. And we, you know what, you don't really have to pay them very much money because they absolutely love it. And there was one example of a theatre in London, 2 theatres which were joined in London, and they were run by a husband and wife team who were just lovers of theatre. They really got it. The art meant a lot to them. They couldn't afford to pay vast amounts, but they could afford to pay proper living wage. And then they moved on and they sold it to some kind of, I wouldn't go as far as maybe a multinational conglomerate, but you know, one of those big groups of thing, the CEO of whom had come from something like GlaxoSmithKline. What does he know or she know about our business? And so what then started to happen was that shows which used to have been brought in from pub theatres, these fantastic theatres which are, you know, using young writers, you know, music is being written, all of the things that we're all talking about. And it was hey, we really love that. Let's bring you into this show, which is more central in London. But you'll have to do it for £200 a week. And that's absolutely the same thing. And I suspect, Lisa, that the writers are told, well, it's your chance to get your work. So we're not actually going to pay you anything, but we'll give you a couple of tickets for the opening night. So
and
that's
exposure.
Yeah. So it's exactly, we're all suffering. It's very interesting. We're all suffering from the same things.
I think it's a lot of symptoms of the same disease. I'm going to bring Tessa Milligan in next, who is on the Open Labour Committee and is also an actor herself. So Tessa.
Hi, I'm an actor. My other job is in childcare, and I'm wondering what the increase in digitisation could mean for accessibility to arts education for young people and for children. I know there's a fair bit online already, but particularly in terms of what the panelists have already said about increasing opportunities for working class kids and opening up doors to a world they might otherwise not get access to, and also for disabled young people as well, increasing accessibility.
Tracy, I know you're absolutely passionate about this. I'm going to bring you in.
Great stuff. Thank you. And Tessa, what a brilliant job you're doing as your second job in childcare. And as the Shadow Minister for Early Years prior to this role, I know that the amazing work that you do transforming children's lives and outcomes and closing the disadvantage gap. But your sector, you're under siege from both sides because the early years sector has not been considered at all in the financial planning post-COVID, because their nurseries are closing hand over fist because of all sorts of circumstances. So to say for young actors, I think this is going to be particularly challenging. I've written to all the drama schools about their offer for young actors who are graduating this year, because they're not going to get the showcase that they were basically paying for in order to get an agent. Because for those who don't know much about drama school, certainly if you're doing an MA for a year, £14,000, you only get 10,000 on a loan, so you have to find the extra 4 or 6 or however many more over the 10 grand it is yourself. So you've paid out massive amounts. What you want is the golden ticket into the industry, which is into acting, through getting an agent or a casting director seeing you and giving you a job. Now that public forum has gone, so we've got a whole cohort of young actors coming out of drama school and they won't have an agent and they can't get going. So they're going to be competing with last year's cohort of young actors who are also in the same boat. And I really do worry about the erosion of rights and salaries that's going to happen to those young people who are so enthusiastic, desperate to get in. And certainly for working class actors and young people, a conservatoire training is probably the only thing that's going to help you get into the industry. For so many others, it's who you know, who your parents know, the people in your street who are casting directors or agents because you live in London. others have other opportunities. For working class actors, all you've got is that you went to RADA, or that you went to, I don't know, Guildhall or something, and not to have those shows is really difficult. So I've been pressing for those conservatoires to have public showings later in the autumn, so that these young people can get going. But also, it's really important, as people have said on this Zoom, we have to have culture embedded into our school system, because that is the only way, having it on the EBAC, that's the only way so many young kids are going to have access to drama, music, dance. It'll be an opportunity for them to try it, to see if they've got the skills for it, because otherwise, if it's not in school, there's no way parents can pay for extracurricular, out of school Saturday classes or whatever. So we're going to lose a whole cohort. And I have tried on many occasions in meetings with Damien Hines and others, please put another pillar into the EBAC, which is a creative subject. And Damien Hines quote, you just said to me, it's not going to make any difference, Tracy. But I know, growing up on that council estate in Batley, I know there's so many kids for whom that would make a massive difference if it's on the curriculum. And when it comes to digitisation, I really could weep, because there is so much going online that it's very hard to recoup any income. And certainly when you're starting out without an agent, you think, I'll make a show, I'll do a thing. You put it online, you get nothing. But those teams of people in large organizations and development production companies who are trawling through YouTube looking for ideas, that idea is not yours, it's out there, it's built on by someone else takes it and they make the money out of it and you don't. So I feel for you, it's tough, but please don't leave, please do keep going.
Maureen and Paul, I imagine this is something you come up against all the time. Do you want to give a sort of equity? Is there an equity response to this? Is something that could help Tess?
The EBAC, absolutely. I'm absolutely astounded by this. It won't make any difference. There is an enormous gap here, isn't there? Because all of the people who are in high up, well, no, that might be an exaggeration. Vast numbers of the majority of the people who are high up in our present government are people who came from schools which have a fully, one of whom, who's extremely important, comes from a school where there is a fully equipped theatre with an artistic director and 6 full-time staff. So that would suggest to me that his parents and the people, and he and the people around him, think that the arts are quite important, and that there's music teachers to teach you. You want to play the bassoon, we'll get you in a bassoonist and we'll get you to all that sort of thing. And the disconnect between that and the people from the working class backgrounds who don't, and the more disadvantaged people, is absolutely enormous. It doesn't, it literally beggars belief. But you were asking about the digital thing. I think digital technology is becoming more and more sophisticated all the time. And I know that, for instance, we were talking about shows being streamed that had been live, the NT Live and all that sort of stuff. And they are becoming more and more and more sophisticated all the time. And I think we're becoming better and better at having interactive things, so that children can interact with a screen as opposed to just sitting there and watching something happening to them. So that I'm hoping that sort of thing will help. This is interim, of course. We hope it will eventually be able to go back to having people in a classroom, because there is nothing like that troupe that came to see you in your classroom and told you a story and took you off to this other place, and you learned so much from it, and then you went, oh, maybe I'd quite like to do that, as Tracy was saying. So yeah, I just wish you well, and we're doing our best.
Thanks, Maureen. We haven't got long, so I'm going to bring in a last question from Kieran, who's involved with the National Theatre of Scotland, which I'm sure Maureen will be pleased to hear. And he's got a question about universal basic income. Kieran.
Hi, so like Alex says, I'm on the board of NTS. I also went to RCS. I was a student there for 2 years. I was the only person in my whole class from Glasgow, and I'm just wondering what the panel think of, I think a problem with a lot of people trying to get into the creative industries is, not having money and not being able to access things like training. Do you think something like a universal basic income could see, more people getting into the creative industries, particularly those, from more working class backgrounds, BAME communities, disabled art performers, all that?
So let's start with Lisa. Will the universal basic income help writers?
It would be enormously beneficial, and I think it would have simplified things right at the start of this crisis if that had been the decision of the government. No phone lines, no ringing in, no panicking, just a universal basic income. It would have made so much sense, but that ship has sailed. But yes, it would. It would mean that writers who do an enormous amount of work for free at the start of their career, building up their portfolio, going to meetings, etc., would feel supported. It would be the same for actors going to auditions and things like that. It would be the same for musicians doing their first gigs, etc. It would be incredibly beneficial for the mental health of the country. I think this is one thing that we haven't touched on, is that when any kind of restriction is lifted and people emerge blinking into the light from their houses and sick of sourdough bread and banana bread, one of the problems we're going to have on is an enormous problem with mental health, and the arts have a huge role to play in that we can affect the discussion that we're going to have about depression and how people feel nervous coming back into the world. And I think the idea of a universal basic income support all that is it's glorious, and I do think the Labour Party should definitely campaign for it, but I think it's a very hard sell at the moment.
Paul, would your members benefit from universal basic income? What's Equity's policy?
As I understand it, our policy is to be in favour of a universal basic income, and I think that all the stuff Lisa said is absolutely correct as to why it would make sense in general terms for people in the creative industries. What I'd say as well is that, of course, at this moment in time, the government could have opted for a £2,500 a month basic income for everybody in order to get us through. Then we wouldn't have the problem as we do with the self-employed support scheme, where we have graduates, carers returning to the industry, and people on particular types of visas falling through the gaps of the scheme. People who appear wealthier than they are because of a couple of lucky runs at one end, or indeed people who actually have portfolio careers working elsewhere, and can't be furloughed from one job and now can't claim or prove that they have primary earnings from self-employment. Actually, why on earth in this moment of all moments could we have not had a universal basic income? And is it an argument that we have to return to for workers in the creative industries as this crisis develops? As I say, our big fear is that you start to roll back sector by sector those employment supports, but the government closes our industry. The government opens in the industry in the way that it closed it, not through mandating and not through engaging with the industry, not through conversations with the working people and employers, but actually just saying we advise audiences don't go to theatres anymore. It's up to the industry as to what they do. If they advise audiences that they can go back, unless they're over 70, of course, which is a large portion of the theatre going population, but the industry's free to reopen, well, we're going to rip away your support. A universal basic income would have sorted that problem, and I think the urgency around it is going to increase. Again, it goes right back to those countries. Spain is a really good example where their creative sector can open, provide the social value that it has to, provide the economic value that it has to earlier than ours, because actually the artists in it are being forced because the industry can open in a way that isn't so economically precarious for it that if it does, it collapses. And I think it is an absolute, we really do have to look at it, and this may well be our moment to do so. I'm not losing hope.
Yeah, thanks. Paul, I think from a Labour point of view, we certainly agree around the need for the government to be more clear and more directive, which would help the industries. I'm not quite sure we're there quite on UBI, but I'm going to bring Tom in before Tracy. So Tom, would a UBI help musicians?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't lucky enough to be around in those days, but every musician and writer I ever meet who's older than me is like, oh yeah, it was great when we were on the dole for 5 years before we got our first gig. And you're like, great, it must have been fantastic when you were claiming dole while you were writing your first album and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a very different world, eh? It would be incredible because we fall into every single other bracket you can imagine, and it's almost perverse that the government didn't go for the cure-all and decided to sort of come up with 50 different ideological ways to get around the problem. it's sort of ridiculous and must be incredibly expensive to administrate as well. They don't even, I mean, Christ knows what the government are thinking of by coming up with all these different schemes that have to review every detail of a business. You know, you're like going, how much is this all costing you to actually implement when you could just be bunging everyone £2,500 a month? Anyway, so that's just a thought that plays in my mind. Yeah. I mean, of course, and all of our crew and all of our people and all of our teams and all of the people who work in management, of which there are hundreds of thousands. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Tom. I think we've got a fairly strong message. I mean, I led a letter before I got a shadow ministerial role calling for an emergency UBI. And I know Tracy signed the letter at that time, so we know where we lie in our hearts. But Tracy, do you want to give a response?
Yeah, I mean, Tom, I too had the dole that helped you through. You could just keep auditioning till you got a job, stop the dole, then get back on the dole again. It would help you and it would save you from starvation. I lobbied really hard at the beginning of this crisis for a universal basic income. Very simple, get everybody, just an emergency, and let's try it, emergency payments across the sector. But then the scheme started to come in, and it does feel like that ship has sailed. It's also, unfortunately, not Labour policy either. And Treasury colleagues have said to me that it's, having done the figures and the number crunching, that it's very, very expensive. It's also regressive in that the wealthiest benefit the most out of it, and the poorest, you know, in sort of an equation, don't really get the. It doesn't seem fair. But I'm with you in my heart, because I do believe, just in the same way that those young people who have families to support them, if you don't have a family, the state must be your family and support you to fulfill your potential. And I think it's really sad that we've missed that boat. But I would say there is still an opportunity for the government to step up and to follow our colleagues in Scotland and Wales, who are giving creatives lump sum grants to get them out of poverty. And those that fall through the net and aren't getting any support at all, at least they can get something from the government, just to make sure that they can keep their head above the parapet. Because, of course, let's look at the social implications of not doing that. Somebody loses, you know, they have no income, so they're going to lose their property, they're going to be homeless. Mental health, the impact of mental health, and some, you know, you've got a very expensive situation where you could have circumvented that at the beginning by supporting them to get them through this crisis and out the other side. So, you know, it feels instinctively the right thing to do, but I feel, just sadly at this point, it feels that the argument has passed us by.
I mean, Obama gave everybody a lump sum grant, didn't he, after the 2008 crash, and even Trump talked about it, but he didn't actually do it. I'd like to thank everybody tonight. It's been an absolute embarrassment to riches, this panel. Thanks to Tracy, Tom, to Lisa, to Paul, to Maureen, to Simon, and to Ian, who had to leave earlier. It's been absolutely brilliant. We could have done a panel on every single one of your areas, a panel on music, a panel on, you know, screen and theatre, a panel on writing, a panel on museums and galleries. We could have just a whole lot. And I think there's a lot more to explore here. So maybe we'll be exploring these in the future, either hosted by ourselves at Open Labour or through our teams, through Tracy and mine's fellow team. So this has been absolutely brilliant. So thank you, everybody. And on Tuesday, we're going to start having in conversation with sessions on Zoom with the new intake of 2019 MPs. People might not know them as well as those of us who have been in slightly longer, like me and Tracy. So the first one on Tuesday is Nadia Whitholm, and we're going to carry on these events over the next weeks while we're still stuck in lockdown. So thanks everybody for viewing, and thanks for coming, and thanks again. It's an absolutely brilliant panel. Thank you, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Yeah, right.